Well, thank you, Alex. You set up quite nicely. I'm going to talk at a higher level than Alex has. I'm talking about key concepts for allocating the cost of water quality management, and I emphasize that I'm talking about allocating costs and not allocating permits, and they're not exactly the same thing. So the question that's more direct in a policy framework is, how do we allocate the rights to discharge nutrients efficiently, equitably, and acceptably? And those are all quite different, potentially quite different objectives. So the first question is that, well, the first major point is that the way that you want to allocate depends very much on the regulatory context that you're going to have in place. So there are sort of two extremes here. So at one extreme, you've got a regulatory system that's extremely flexible and that allows a lot of trading, and the market works perfectly, and there are no difficulties in transferring rights around the landscape, so that who you give them to initially actually has no impact on efficiency, because they will then get traded to the places that can use them most efficiently. So that's sort of the economist's perfect world. Of course, that doesn't exist in reality, but this is a continuum, so you might be able to get somewhere more in that direction. The extreme is where you fix the rights to a particular property and you're not allowed to change the uses afterwards. And then the way you allocate them has an enormous efficiency effect, because it drives the land use, it drives the management options, etc. If you can get down to this end of the regulatory context, then you only need to worry about equity, because the initial allocation is all about who gets wealth and who's going to lose income. And it's not about efficiency, it's not about how the catchment as a whole or the community as a whole is going to do. If you have a rigid system or a market that works very badly, then you're going to have a conflict between equity and efficiency. And inevitably, you're not going to be making a compromise between the two. So this is a pretty strong argument for trying to get as flexible a system as you can, because that then allows much cleaner debates and discussion. It allows better optimization as well. You can do better on both, but it also makes it clear when you're talking about equity, and that's a political discussion, and when you're talking about efficiency, and that's an economic discussion. So what is equity? There will be costs to clean up the lake. There may be some things that people can do just by improving their farm efficiency, but that's not going to take us very far. So there are going to be lost opportunities, there are going to be direct costs of mitigation, but the costs won't only be on the farms either. There are going to be impacts on the communities that are involved, there is going to be loss of employment if there's land use change associated with it, and there are going to be completely different points of view on this. And those perspectives are all valid. There is not one answer to this question. This is a political question, as has been said before. It's not a technical question, so don't go to an economist asking you to tell them what the equitable answer is. We can tell you what the distribution of costs of any particular system will be, but we can't tell you whether that's equitable or not. So our Rotorua group argued about this a lot, as you can probably imagine, and we came up with 7 different principles for how the net costs of a system should be shared. So remembering that there are benefits from cleaning up the lake, or we wouldn't be doing it, and then there are offsetting costs. So the first principle is that the people who like the lake being cleaned up should be the ones who pay. Seems fair. The second one, which has come up a few times today, is that so-called polluters should pay. And that could be the people who are putting nitrates onto the land now, or, given that Rotorua in particular has this long legacy load, it could be the people who put them on 30 years ago, or encourage people to put them on 30 years ago. This is not an economic principle. This is a potential principle of justice that stands alongside other ones. A very, very strongly held principle by particularly people who put a lot of money and have a lot of debt associated with their properties and capital investments is that people have been using this land. They have been putting nutrients onto it. They've made investments on the basis that they'd be able to keep doing that. And so they have implicit rights. And that could be the current users, or it could be someone who bought a really great property that they intended to convert to a dairy farm, and now they can't. Another principle that Alex brought up is don't penalise those who've actually tried hard. So the people who've been cooperative and who've tried to do their best for the lake, they shouldn't be penalised. We should always worry about the poor and the vulnerable. tangata whenua are distinctive, so it's not clear that they should pay more or less, but the way that they think about this needs to be taken into account and is going to be very, very specific to the particular iwi and haka. And finally, sort of an obvious principle, similar sources should be treated similarly. And this sounds really great until you try to define what you mean by similar. And then everyone will have their own definition, which will tend to suit them. So, allowance allocation is important as a way of dealing with this cost sharing because it determines the ultimate costs that different people get, or the net gains that they get out of the regulation as a whole. And someone was talking about the Pareto principle before. We shouldn't be doing this if there isn't a net gain to the community. So there should be net gains around. The question is, how do we spread out the costs so that nobody has too big a cost and ideally everybody gets a net gain? So some of these gains and costs just happen automatically. The public, in general, everyone who loves the lakes, will benefit from the protection. So we all hopefully are getting that in different amounts. On the other hand, the landowners are the ones who actually directly will bear the cost of mitigation. They're the ones who have to go out and change their management practices. So those costs will always fall directly on them. What then changes that is how the allowances are allocated, which is essentially a transfer of wealth on top of that. And that turns into cash because if you have excess that you don't need, you can get some more cash and gain, so that offsets some of the costs you spent on mitigating. But if you have to buy, you're going to bear additional costs. So I'm sure you all love these economics graphs. So this is dollars up here and costs, and across here is nutrients. So this is 0 nutrients, and this is the amount that you do in a system where there is no regulation. As you try to reduce your nutrients going in this direction, the cost of doing that will go up and up and up. At first, there'll be some quite easy things to do, the sort of things that Taupo did back in the 1980s. And then it will get more and more costly, and at some point, what you're talking about is actually a non-viable farm and having to swap into a less productive land use. And the total cost of reaching the cap, if you think of this at a catchment level, is the area under this. It's this little cost plus that one, plus that one, plus that one, all the way up until you actually reach your target. And this, the price in the market, is the cost of the last unit that you have to do. The allowances are all valued at this marginal price. And the allowances are the difference between 0 all the way up to the cap. So the direct costs might, and this is not a modelling result, this is a word picture, but the direct costs are often actually quite small relative to the value of these allowances. So that's why these debates are always very heavily around the values of the allowances. Of course, that is going to vary from catchment to catchment depending on how stringent the targets are and so on. If it is possible that landowners can gain with full grandparenting. So if you had a free allocation, well, this isn't full grandparenting, this is slightly less, slightly less than free grandparenting. So suppose you've still got the same catchment cap, but this particular farmer is given a free allocation that is above what he will want to do in the long run, what the efficient outcome is. Then he's going to do some mitigation. He's going to mitigate until he's back to the efficient level, and that's going to cost him some money. But because he's been freely allocated quite a large number of units, all the way from there to there, when he does this last bit of his mitigation, he's going to sell some stuff. So now, because of the free allocation, he's bearing this cost of mitigation, well, actually all of this cost of mitigation, but he's getting even more for the value of the allowances he sells. And this depends on how high the allowance price actually goes relative to how much mitigation has to be done in the catchment. And again, that's a catchment by catchment issue. So what we kind of came up with in Rotorua was trying to find a compromise between these different principles. And because the people in the room were different and actually had different preferences and different concerns. So first, thinking solely about equity, the critical thing seemed to be that we want to compensate for part of the loss in asset value. And as Mike very vehemently and clearly pointed out, property values, when you put on a really stringent regulation, will go down, and they'll go down quite a lot. And a lot of that value is then transmitted into the allowance value. If you give them some of the allowances, you're giving them back some of that allowance value. And that's That's a way of protecting people who might have only bought the farm a few years ago, incurred a huge debt, and now suddenly they have an asset that's worth a lot less than they thought. The other principle was not penalising those who've mitigated, and this led us to a very similar conclusion to what Alec just suggested. We called it potential nutrient loss, but it's essentially the same thing as using natural capital. But in this case, we'd be using natural capital to assess what sort of nutrient loss might you expect if this land was used to its full potential. So it's nothing to do with how stuff leaches off it. It's what sort, is this land not just the soil, but the slope and the weather? What is this really good land that could be used for a dairy farm that would have very intensive nutrient loss, or for arable, or is it actually really low quality land that you'd only put forestry on anyway? But then we also wanted to consider efficiency. And a critical issue for efficiency is avoiding strategic behaviour, or what's sometimes called baseline grabbing. So what you really don't want to do is start a conversation about having a regulation and have it go on for 10 years, and over the 10 years everyone thinks they're going to grandparent. I better get my nutrient loss up so that when they come in and put in the limit based on a particular year, mine's going to be really high, and then I'll get lots of allowances. And so it's really critical, and I think the systems that we've looked at so far have done this, to create a year very early on in the process. Make sure you've got the data so that when 10 years later you have worked out what you're going to do, you can go back to that year and use that year, or use some sort of natural capital-based approach. The other efficiency issue is minimising adjustment costs. People have a lot of investments in their own set of skills, in the place they've chosen to live, because they're the sort of person who likes to be a dairy farmer and likes to live there, but also in their dairy shed and their particular herd and so on. You can't instantly change those investments, so you want a period where they can adjust. You also don't want people to suddenly have to come completely up to speed with nutrient trading and how do you mitigate and how do you remanage your farm for nutrient use per dollar, etc. You want to give them some time to adjust. And that argues for basing your allocation more on current emissions, or a measure of recent emissions. So really this came down to a short-term, long-term trade-off. In the short term, markets are not going to work particularly well, and there's going to be a lot of cost adjustment. People won't know what they're doing, and that tends you to want to allocate more on the basis of current emissions, current land use, current practices. In the long term, markets are going to evolve. People will learn, the price will become clearer, people can make new investments, assets will have depreciated, so they won't be of concern. People might have paid back some of their debt. And farmers in our group with debt said, we have really high discount rates. What matters in the next 5 years is absolutely critical to us. What happens 20 or 30 years away is much less critical. And in contrast, for the equity issues in the Rotorua catchment, it was very much around foresters and around the iwi. And both of them actually had very low discount rates. They care a lot about the future. They care about the present, obviously, as well. But they were less focused on the present and much more concerned that in the long run, this would be an equitable solution. So what we concluded is that you should have a different system in the short run than the long run, and something that transitions through to something that's based on equity. So key takeaway messages: increase your flexibility where possible so that you don't have to consider efficiency in the initial allocation in the long run. Focus on the equity of the cost bearing and not on the allocation itself. So you need to take into account where the costs and benefits are going to fall, as well as where the allocation is going. And try to avoid reallocation. Try to avoid changes in the rules, so that you don't have this sort of strategic behaviour going on. So setting out a transition path as far into the future as you can, or at least the rules by which that transition path is going to evolve, is really helpful. I'll stop there.